For thousands of years, there was a nut that fed North America, long before grocery stores, long before imported almonds, long before nutrition labels and protein powders. A nut so dense in calories and protein that a small handful could sustain hard labor for hours. A nut that indigenous nations relied on through winter, famine, and migration. A nut that once shaped where people lived, how they traveled, and how they survived. Today, almost no one eats it, not because it disappeared, not because it lost its value, but because it never fit the system that replaced it. This is the story of America's most powerful native nut, a food richer than almonds, tougher than walnuts, and missing from nearly every store. Long before European settlement, hickory forests covered vast stretches of North America. From the Great Lakes to the southeast, these trees were everywhere. And where hickories grew, people followed. Indigenous nations such as the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Iroquois, and many others depended on hickory nuts as a staple. Not a snack, not a garnish. A foundation. Hickory nuts were harvested in massive quantities every fall. Families gathered them by the basket. They were cracked, ground, boiled, and transformed into something more valuable than raw calories, hickory milk and hickory oil. The process was simple, but powerful. Crushed nuts were boiled in water. The fat rose to the surface and was skimmed off. What remained was a rich, creamy liquid, dense in protein, fat, and minerals. It could be drunk, cooked into stews, poured over vegetables, or mixed with grains. This was not just food, it was fuel. Hickory nuts contain more fat than most nuts and more protein per ounce than almonds. They are exceptionally high in calories, rich in magnesium, manganese, and healthy fatty acids. For people living physically demanding lives, hunting, farming, traveling, this mattered. One hickory tree could produce hundreds of pounds of nuts in a good year. A grove could sustain an entire community. And unlike annual crops, hickories required no plowing, no irrigation, no seed saving. The forest did the work. This is why early American settlements clustered near hickory forests. Colonists quickly adopted indigenous knowledge, relying on hickory oil as cooking fat and a trade good. In the 1700s and the early 1800s, hickory nuts were a common food in rural America. They were gathered, cracked, eaten raw, baked into breads, and pressed for oil. For a time, hickory was everywhere. Then it vanished. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but systematically. As America industrialized, food systems began to favor speed, uniformity, and scalability. Crops that could be planted in rows, harvested by machines, shipped long distances, and sold year-round replaced foods that required patience and local knowledge. Hickory nuts did not fit. Their shells are thick and irregular. Their harvest timing varies by tree and year. Their cracking cannot be easily mechanized without damage. From an industrial perspective, hickories were inefficient. Almonds, on the other hand, could be grown in massive monoculture orchards, irrigated heavily, harvested mechanically, processed uniformly, and shipped globally. Walnuts and pecans followed similar paths. Hickory did not. It was labeled impractical and wild, too hard to process. The nut that once fed millions was quietly excluded from the modern food economy. By the early 20th century, hickory nuts were no longer sold widely. Knowledge of how to process them faded. What remained was cultural memory, stories of grandparents cracking nuts by hand, of hickory milk made in rural kitchens, of a food that once mattered. Then came another shift. As agriculture expanded, forests were cleared. Hickory trees were cut for lumber, burned for fuel, or removed to make way for fields, roads, and cities. Unlike orchards, hickories were rarely replanted. They take years to mature. They do not produce immediate profit. And so, a food that required time was replaced by foods that promised speed. But nutrition did not improve. Modern diets became calorie-rich but nutrient-poor. Protein sources shifted toward industrial meat and imported nuts grown under intense irrigation. Almond orchards drained water tables. Monocultures required pesticides, fertilizers, and constant intervention. Meanwhile, hickory trees continued to grow quietly in forests, along roadsides, and in forgotten land, producing one of the most nutrient-dense native foods on the continent. Modern nutritional analysis confirms what indigenous knowledge already understood. Hickory nuts contain more fat than almonds, often more than 70% fat. They are high in protein, energy-dense, and rich in minerals, essential for muscle function and metabolic health. Their fatty acid profile supports long-lasting energy rather than blood sugar spikes. This is not a superfood by marketing definition. It is a survival food by design. So why don't you see it in stores? Because hickory resists the logic of modern food systems. You cannot harvest it all at once. You cannot standardize its size. You cannot easily automate its processing. It demands local harvesting, seasonal eating, and participation. Participation is inefficient in a system built on passive consumption. Grocery stores thrive on uniformity. Products must look the same, behave the same, and move quickly. Hickory nuts refuse to comply. Each tree is different. Each shell is different. Each harvest requires attention. From the perspective of industry, that is a flaw. From the perspective of resilience, it is a strength. Hickory trees are drought-tolerant. They thrive without irrigation. They stabilize soil. They support wildlife. They sequester carbon. They produce food year after year without chemicals or fertilizers. In a time of climate instability, that matters. As water scarcity worsens, almond production becomes increasingly fragile. As supply chains stretch thinner, reliance on distant food sources grows risky. As energy costs rise, highly processed foods become expensive. And yet, America already has a native nut perfectly adapted to its climate, growing without permission, producing without subsidy, feeding without infrastructure. It is simply ignored. Not because it failed, because it does not fit a system built on control. There is no billion-dollar hickory industry, no advertising campaigns, no branded hickory milk on shelves, because you cannot easily own a forest. The knowledge, however, is not gone. Foragers still collect hickory nuts each fall. Indigenous communities continue to prepare traditional hickory foods. Small-scale producers press hickory oil by hand. Researchers quietly study native nuts for their nutritional and ecological value. What they find is consistent. Hickory is one of the most energy-dense, protein-rich, and sustainable foods native to North America. It was never replaced because it was inferior. It was replaced because it was inconvenient. But convenience has a cost. As modern diets contribute to metabolic disease, environmental degradation, and dependency on fragile supply chains, the foods that once sustained people through uncertainty begin to matter again. Hickory does not promise convenience. It promises resilience. It asks you to notice the seasons, to gather, to process, to participate. That is why it fed people for thousands of years, and that is why it vanished from shelves. America's most powerful native nut did not disappear. It was pushed aside, still growing, still producing, still waiting. Not for rediscovery, but for recognition. Because the future of food may not depend on inventing something new. It may depend on remembering what already works, growing quietly in the forests we stopped paying attention to.